Hey, what's going on, guys? Blunt Cuts here. This is a Watcher of Realms video. Thanks so much for tuning into my channel. I always appreciate it. I'm going to be breaking down Vorn, doing some damage testing here today. Now, of course, it's not the first time that I have tested Vorn. Last week, I did put out a number of videos where I tested the Poisoner comp with Nastya, with Numera, and of course, with Vorn, who is on the screen right now. And what I found was that Vorn, in that specific comp with Nastya as a Lord, was doing very, very good damage. Not as good as Numera, but he is an enabler for sure. He is a solid addition to the Poison comp. But the question I really have is, how dependent on that comp is he? What kind of damage does he do as a Piercer? Because he is dual faction. He is an Esotericist, but he's also a Piercer. So you could run him with Yovar or with Aracha. Numera is also an Esotericist and Piercer dual faction unit. So you can run both of them as a Piercer if you so choose. But how effective are both of those heroes? That's what I'm going to try to answer in this video today. I'm going to start off with some Vorn testing as a Piercer. We're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk briefly about how that compares to his damage as a Poisoner. And then I'm going to run Numera and Vorn together. I've done a lot of testing on these Poison champions over the past week. If you are looking for a specific scenario to be tested, I've probably already covered it. Check out my other videos. Alternately, I will have a link to all the data that I have assembled on this in a single spreadsheet, which will be linked in a Google Doc in the description of the video. So go ahead and check that out there. But for now, I think let's get into some testing on Vorn. The last thing I will ask, take 1 second, please click that thumbs up button, like the video. It makes a massive difference to the way that YouTube distributes my video and shows it to other people, suggests it to other people. The more likes I can get, the more reach I get, the more people do get this information. And I do think it's good information for the community to have. And obviously it does help my channel as well. I want to grow, and I really appreciate all the support that you guys have shown me. This is a free way that you can continue to show that support. So thank you so much if it is something you can do. Let's go take a look at the team that I use to test Vorn as a Piercer. All right, so this is the squad that I went with when I was trying to test Vorn. Vorn is a marksman, obviously, and I wanted to test him against other marksmen. Hex is kind of a standard in all of my testing videos. I like to use him as a measuring stick. Silas is another one that I've used a lot. I did want to add him in there as another point of comparison. I've, of course, got Yovar as the Lord in here. We've got Diaochan, who's going to be providing inspiration as well as a 20% penetration buff to all 3 damage dealers in here. And we've also got Eloin in there for rage regen. I'm going to show you the run. Then we're going to come back to the spreadsheet. I'm going to talk about the damage that Vorn did in this comp, and I'm going to compare that to the damage he did in the Esotericist Poison comp with Nastya. Let's take a look. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed that. Let me go through these numbers real quick here because there's a lot of information I'm going to try to get to you in this video. So we're going to burn through this real quick. Hex was the top damage at every single one of these awakening levels. So he is going to be the baseline for all these comparisons with Vorn as a Piercer. Vorn was closest to Hex's damage at a 0, doing 87.43% of Hex's damage, coming in at about 114 million damage. His A1 gives him the ability to buff 1 more unit with his shield break ability, which increases the damage that those units do to shields. It also increases the damage bonus that shield break ability does provide, going from 30% to 40% damage. So he's helping out other units in here, but he's not really helping himself. As a result, he ended up only doing about 80% of Hex's damage at A1, coming in at 116 million, a 1.53% increase going from A0 to A1. I think that increase is largely just RNG. At the end of the day, I wouldn't make much of it. I don't think he should really be getting any damage going from A0 to A1 himself, but he will do a better job of buffing other units, which will result in more damage for your entire team. For comparison, Silas at A1 did about 71% of Hex's damage. Moving on to A3, this is the big bump for Hex where he basically doubles his ultimate duration and his damage just kind of skyrockets at that point. He gained 34.62% damage going from A1 to A3. Vorn, on the other hand, only gained 6.4% damage. He gains the ability to double hit on his Flesh Warp ability, and that is nice, but it's just not enough to really close the gap. Hex's A3 is one of the best in the game, and Vorn's just does not compete as far as his personal damage is concerned. He ended up doing about 63% of Hex's damage, coming in at about 123.5 million damage at A3. Silas ended up losing ground, although I do think in this particular test, there was some bad RNG at play. Silas should gain about 15% damage at A3. He gained in this test about 6.3%, so I think this was a bad run for Silas, but it is what it is. The A5 is a smaller bump for Hex, but it is still a significant one. He gained about 12% damage going from A3 to A5. Vorn, on the other hand, only gains the 5% penetration buff on his A4. The A5 for Vorn does not actually buff his damage at all. It is a utility buff, and that means he did lose a significant amount of ground to Hex. He did 128 million at A5, and he gained about 3.57% damage going from A3 to A5, but because Hex gained more, that means that Vorn only ended up doing at A5 about 58.45% of Hex's damage. For comparison, A5 Silas did 61.38% of Hex's damage there. So very similar, but slightly more than Vorn. If you want an idea of how much damage A5 Vorn is going to do in a fight like this, it's likely going to be similar to Silas. One thing I will note here, for both Silas and for Vorn, they both have defense ignore and magic resist ignore components to their kit respectively. Now those effects are not as impactful on Nightmare 4 Guild boss because the magic resist and defense values for the boss are so low that ignoring a percentage of them just really doesn't enhance the damage in the way that it would in a lot of other areas in the games. Looking at the right hand side of the sheet here, I do have a table where I have broken down the gear and stats that each of these heroes did have in all of this testing. Now, I'm not going to go through them individually right now. I tried to make them as close as possible, but you're more than welcome to take a look yourself. If you have questions, feel free to ask them in the comments or hop on my Discord, which will be linked in the description of this video as well, and you can ask me directly there. Finally, on this page, I do have a damage relative to Hex table here where I have broken down all of those relative damage numbers that I was just going through into a small bite-sized table for your convenience. Let's go take a look at the Poisoner testing so we can get an idea of how this damage compares to Vorn in a Poisoner comp. All right, so I am on my Nastya testing page right here. In the far right column of these damage figures, I have added in the numbers that I got from Vorn as a Piercer. It's not a one-to-one comparison here, obviously, but it should give us an idea of what he is losing going from one to the other. So at A0, Vorn in a Poisoner comp was doing 153 million. He was doing about 40 million less, or somewhere in the neighborhood of 25% less damage as a Piercer than he was with Nastya as a Lore. Same rings true for A1 since he doesn't really gain any damage. The A3 and the A5 tell a similar story where we are looking at about a 25% damage increase. So the damage increases Awakening over Awakening were relatively close at all these different Awakening levels. It looks like he did gain a little bit more as an Esotericist going from A1 to A3, as well as going from A3 to A5, but minimal differences. And honestly, these numbers are close enough that I would not be surprised if a lot of it was RNG at the end of the day, but you are looking at essentially a 25% damage reduction if you do run Vorn as a Piercer versus as a Esotericist in a Poisoner comp with Nastya and Numera. That's good to know, but one thing I will point out is that his shield break ability does not have anything to do with being a Poisoner or being a Piercer, meaning that it will be just as effective for the DPS that are on the field, regardless of which comp you do use. So as an enabler, he is going to do just as good a job as a Piercer versus as a Poisoner as far as the shield break is concerned. But one question I had as I did this was, if I were to add Numera in as a Piercer, bring another Poison Champ in as a Piercer then, how is that going to change the calculus? And are we going to regain some of the ground that Numera lost when I tested her as a solo Poisoner in the Piercer comp last week? So, that said, let's go take a look at the numbers that I got from that. So I redid the same testing, except this time the damage dealers in this comp were Hex, Vorn, and Numera. So we retained Hex as the baseline here, but instead of Silas, I did bring in Numera, and I wanted to see exactly how more poison being present would influence both Numera and Vorn's damage. So a couple of things that are relevant here. Vorn has two abilities, his ultimate and his flesh warp ability, that do gain up to 30% damage increase, 1% per stack of poison on the target. But he himself can only apply 20 stacks of poison at a time, meaning that he needs another source of poison in the comp in order to really max out the potential of those two damage increases. That's where Numera comes in. She is going to help him gain some damage that way, or at least that was my hope. As we look at the numbers here, it does not really seem like that was the case. He did a little bit more, I do believe, at A0 and A1, but A3 and A5 were almost identical to the damage that he did as a piercer without another poisoner in the comp. Numera, on the other hand, though, did seem to gain a pretty significant chunk of damage by having more poisons in the target, which is because a big chunk of her damage does come from poison explosion, that toxic surge damage that she does, where she takes poison on the target and converts that into direct damage, magnified because all of a sudden she had up to another 20 stacks of poison on the target that she could convert into direct damage. And so that resulted in extra damage for her. You can see it in the column right there, but I think it's easier to see on the next page that I'm going to show you. I've broken down exactly how much damage Numera and Vorn both gained or lost when they were on the team together versus when they were the only poisoner in the comp. And it's pretty staggering. Numera gained a lot of damage, not enough to put her on par with when she was in the Esotericist Nastya comp, but a lot of damage. She gained back a lot of the damage that she lost when I tested her as a solo poisoner in the Piercer comp last week. So using those numbers here, at A0, almost exactly a 30% increase for Numera over her solo poisoner numbers. She gained close to 20% damage at A1, 33%, so a full third, almost 50 million damage at A3, and then at A5, about 28% damage, coming in at 196 million at A5. So very, very impressive for Numera. Now, I think my top damage number for her at A5 in the poison comp was 272 million, so we're still a far cry from that. But she was doing 92% of A5 Hex's damage at A5 herself. And at A3, she was doing 93.29% of A3 Hex's damage. So very, very impressive. Going back to this summary sheet right here, I'll talk about Vorn quickly because there's really not that much to talk about here, because what we see here is really no more than a 2% shift at any of these awakening levels between when he was a solo poisoner and when he was combined with Numera. Now, I think the reason for this is because the main benefit that he gets from having another poisoner in the comp is that he now is able to stack up more damage bonus from having more poisons on the target. But in this case, Numera is constantly removing those stacks of poison, meaning that there's a percentage of time in here where he actually has less stacks of poison on the target than he did when he was the only poisoner in the comp. Now, there are times when he had more because Numera is stacking up poison as well. I think the net effect of this is ultimately that he didn't really gain or lose all that much at any of these awakening levels. You can see at A0, he gained 0.63%. At A1, he lost 1.84%. At A3, he gained 2.31%. And then at A5, he lost 1.5%. And that, to me, just screams not all that impactful. But I think when you consider that, again, he is an enabler, he is really enabling Numera to do some pretty impressive damage as a piercer here, which is great news for those of us who did not pull Nastya but did pull Numera. When I say those of us, I'm, of course, not talking about myself because I struck out on both of them. But if you got Numera but didn't get Nastya, there is still hope. Vorn may have increased value for you. So I thought this was very relevant info in the case of Vorn, because I know a lot of people were very frustrated with the results that they got from their summoning last week. A lot of people have been sounding off in the comments of my videos. And so I feel compelled to make a disclaimer here and say that whenever I make any of these videos, I am not telling you you need to pull or you should pull, or I'm certainly not telling you ever that you should spend. What I'm trying to do is give you an accurate picture of how good a hero is so that you can make that decision yourself, because ultimately whether or not you should pull is going to depend largely on your own account, your own bank account. What I can say here is that Vorn is a very, very solid enabler for Abyss 1, which is currently the hardest content in the game. I think he's probably going to be relevant in Abyss 2 as well, so I think he's going to be helpful in content moving forward. Bottom line, even if you don't have Nastya, he's going to do solid work for you, enabling Numera, and I still think the biggest draw for him is that he is going to be able to buff shield damage regardless of faction, meaning that if you get him at A0, he is going to be able to buff not just himself with extra shield damage, but also the 2 units with the highest attack on the field, which you can manipulate to make sure that, say, Wukong and Kagiri get it to help you break the physical shield. If you get into A1, you can add another unit into that attack manipulation to target those shield break buffs to help you break either the magic or the physical damage shield, depending on your own account. And I think that is very, very powerful. It's why I personally am going to pull. I don't have very much. There's like next to no chance I do get him, but I'm going to toss what I have at this guy and see if I can't snag him, because I do think he is going to help out, not just here, but probably in other content as well going forward. But hopefully you can click that thumbs up button. Hopefully you can subscribe to my channel so you can get my stuff in the future. I do appreciate you all tuning in as always. So if you are summoning, good luck. If you aren't, completely reasonable as well. Good luck either way. I will catch you all next time.